before the brothers tore the world apart with their war, before the 5 colors of magic were understood and named, before the ice came and the thaw followed, before recorded history itself began to keep count of the years, there was an empire. It rose from the eastern mists of a continent called Phyrexia, on the plain known as Dominaria. Its people called themselves the Thran, and for countless generations they built wonders that would never be matched. Their towers touched the clouds. Their cities floated upon invisible tides of power. Their artifacts hummed with energies drawn from the very fabric of reality, folded and compressed into crystalline stones that glowed with inner light. This is the story of that empire, of its glory, its hubris, and its fall, of the brilliant minds who shaped it and the darker ambitions that destroyed it, of love and betrayal, of science and sorcery, of the thin line between healing and harm. The Thran Empire would last for millennia, but its final chapter, the 9 years that led to its destruction, would cast shadows across 5,000 years of history and give birth to the greatest evil the multiverse would ever know. Let us drift back through the ages, to a time when the world was young and humanity reached for perfection through artifice and ingenuity. Let us walk the gleaming streets of Halcyon, the floating capital, and descend into the darkness of the caves of the damned. Let us witness the slow corruption of good intentions and the terrible price of ambition unchecked. This is the story of the Thran. In the time before time was properly counted, the Thran migrated from the east. Where they came from, no record remembers. Perhaps they sailed across forgotten seas, or perhaps they simply walked from regions that would later sink beneath the waves or crumble into dust. What matters is that they came to Phyrexia, a broad and fertile continent blessed with rich veins of metal in its mountains and dense forests in its valleys, and they saw potential. The early Thran were not so different from other humans of that age. They hunted, they farmed, they built settlements of wood and stone, but they possessed something that set them apart: a hunger for understanding, a refusal to accept the world as it was without asking how it might be improved. While other cultures turned to the spiritual, seeking answers in the movement of stars or the whispers of spirits, the Thran turned inward, to the material world, to the physical laws that governed all things. They studied the properties of metals, learning which could be shaped and which would shatter. They experimented with alloys, discovering combinations that produced materials stronger and more resilient than any single element. They built forges that burned hotter than any natural flame, and wheels that turned with perfect precision. Generation by generation, they accumulated knowledge, and that knowledge became power. The breakthrough came when a Thran scholar, their name lost to history though their discovery would echo through the ages, learned to fold space itself into a crystalline matrix. They called these creations powerstones, and they revolutionized everything the Thran had built before. A powerstone was not merely a battery, though it could store vast amounts of energy. It was not merely a tool, though it could amplify the will of its wielder. A powerstone contained within its latticed structure a stable pocket dimension, an artificial plane too small for any living thing to enter but large enough to hold possibilities. The stone's interior space could be shaped, programmed, aligned to specific purposes. One stone might regulate temperature, keeping a building warm in winter and cool in summer without any external fuel source. Another might provide propulsion, allowing vehicles to move without wheels or sails. Still another might serve as a nexus of communication, carrying voices and images across vast distances. The powerstones changed everything. Within a few generations, Thran society transformed. Villages became towns, towns became cities, and cities learned to float. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity, though monumentally complex in execution. Large power stones, carefully arranged in geometric patterns, created fields of force that could counteract gravity itself. Buildings no longer needed foundations sunk deep into bedrock. They could rest upon invisible cushions of energy, held aloft by the same forces that kept the stars in the sky. The Thran built platforms of metal and stone, installed power stone matrices beneath them, and watched as their creations rose into the air like impossible dreams made real. The advantages were numerous. Floating cities didn't need to worry about floods or ground-shaking quakes. They could be positioned to take advantage of favorable weather patterns or moved when danger approached, though in practice such relocations were rare and required immense coordination. The very act of living in the sky spoke to the Thran's mastery over the natural world. They had transcended the limitations that bound other peoples to the ground. Over time, the Thran Empire grew to encompass 8 great city-states, each a marvel of artifice and ambition. There was Phenon, the oldest, nestled in the mountains where the first power stone forges had been built. There was Neuron, known for its vast libraries. Seton, where the best airship captains trained. Orleson, whose hanging gardens were said to rival paradise itself. Chinon, famous for its music and art. Lausanne, a trade hub. Wington, where the finest artificers studied their craft. And above them all, in prestige if not always in power, there was Halcyon. Halcyon. Even the name suggests calm waters, peaceful times, golden summers that stretch on forever. And for a time, that's what it was. The jewel of the Thran Empire. The city where the finest minds gathered, where the greatest works were created, where the future was forged in workshops that hummed with power stone energy day and night. Picture it as it was in those days. A city suspended in the air above a volcanic crevice, held aloft by a vast power stone matrix that drew power from the geothermal energy below and the ambient mana of the sky above. The city's underbelly was a wonder of engineering. Metal frameworks and stabilizing gyroscopes, cooling vents and energy conduits, all working in perfect harmony to keep hundreds of thousands of tons of stone and metal and living flesh floating in defiance of gravity's pull. Above this foundation, the city proper sprawled outward in concentric rings. At the center stood the halls of the council, where the empire's leaders met to debate and vote on matters of importance. Surrounding it were the estates of the elite, the artificers, the architects, the scholars, and merchants who had proven their worth to the empire and earned their place among the decision-makers. These estates were marvels in themselves, with private gardens that bloomed year-round thanks to climate-controlling power stones, and workshops where prototype artifacts were tested away from prying eyes. Beyond the inner ring lay the districts where most Halcyonites lived and worked. Here, the streets were wide and clean, paved with a ceramic compound that never wore out and never gathered dust. Fountains fed by aquifer stones provided clean water to every neighborhood. Public conveyances, floating platforms guided along prescribed routes, carried citizens from one end of the city to the other in minutes. Shops offered goods from across the empire and beyond. Fine silks from distant Kalaman, worked leather from Shiv's heat forges, strange vegetables from plains that could only be reached through experimental portals. It was a civilization at its zenith. The Thran of Halcyon wanted for nothing. Disease was rare, quickly cured by healing magic. Hunger was unknown. Agricultural power stones ensured bountiful harvests in the farms that dotted the land far below the floating cities. Crime was minimal. Who would steal when all had plenty? Conflict was a memory. The empire had no enemies. For who would dare challenge such power? In the workshops and laboratories of Halcyon, artificers pursued increasingly ambitious projects. They built golems that could think and learn. They created vehicles that could travel beneath the waves or soar higher than the highest mountains. They experimented with power stones of ever greater complexity, stones within stones, miniature realities nested like boxes within boxes. One artificer in particular stood out among his peers. His name was Glacian, and he was brilliant. Glacian was tall and lean, with the long fingers of someone who spent his days manipulating delicate components, and the focused gaze of someone who could envision structures that didn't yet exist. He had a gift for seeing patterns where others saw only chaos, for understanding how individual pieces might fit together to create something greater than the sum of their parts. While other artificers specialized in specific applications, one building better propulsion systems, another perfecting climate control. Glacian saw the bigger picture. He understood Power Stone technology not as a collection of discrete techniques, but as a unified theory, a comprehensive system that could be pushed further and further toward perfection. It was Glacian who designed the Mana Rig, the massive facility that produced the most powerful power stones Halcyon had ever created. The rig was positioned directly below the city, extending down into the volcanic crevice to tap the raw energies that pulsed through the bedrock. The heat was tremendous, the forces involved almost incomprehensible, but Glacian's designs channeled everything perfectly. Raw mana flowed up through conduits of specially treated metal, was filtered and refined by miles of intricate machinery, and emerged as pure crystalline power stones, each one a masterwork of controlled creation. The rig was Glacian's greatest achievement, though he had many. It was also, though he didn't know it yet, the seed of the Empire's destruction. For beneath the city, in the caves that lay under the Mana Rig, lived those that Halcyon had forgotten, the untouchables, the exiled. The sick and the troublesome and the inconvenient, all pushed down into darkness where the privileged citizens above wouldn't have to think about them. The Thran prided themselves on being a utopian society, but like all utopias, theirs required a certain willful blindness to maintain. The caves had always served as a dumping ground for those who didn't fit, political dissidents who questioned the council's decisions too loudly, criminals whose crimes were too public to ignore but not severe enough to warrant execution, the mentally ill, the chronically unlucky, the persistently poor, anyone really who disrupted the careful harmony of life above. It was easy to forget about them. Out of sight, out of mind, the Power Stone networks didn't extend down into the caves, so there was no light except what the untouchables could make themselves. No clean water, no climate control, no public conveyances. Just damp rock and dripping stone, the distant thunder of the Mana Rig above, and the constant, inescapable knowledge that the people living in luxury a few hundred feet overhead had decided you didn't matter. And there was something else in those caves. Something the people of Halcyon didn't know about. Something that seeped from the Mana Rig's imperfect seals, that radiated through the stone, that saturated the very air the untouchables breathed with every inhalation. Power Stone radiation. The Thran Empire's perfection was built on a foundation of contradictions. It prized reason and logic, yet its healing relied on intuitive magic that few understood. It celebrated progress, yet feared change that came too quickly. It proclaimed equality under law, yet maintained a rigid social hierarchy. These contradictions had existed for centuries without causing serious problems, the way a building's structural flaws might go unnoticed for generations if the weather remains fair and no one leans too hard against the walls. But as Halcyon's golden age stretched on, as the city grew larger and more complex, as the Power Stone technology became more sophisticated and more deeply integrated into every aspect of life, those contradictions began to show. The breaking point came from an unexpected direction. Not from external enemies, the Thran had none that mattered. Not from resource scarcity. The Empire was wealthy beyond measure. Not from natural disaster. Power Stone technology had insulated them from such concerns. The crisis came from within, from a debate that began among scholars and gradually spread until it tore the Empire's social fabric apart. The question was simple. How should the Thran continue to improve themselves? On one side stood the Artificers, the traditional power base of Thran society. Their answer was clear. Continue perfecting Power Stone technology. Build better artifacts. Design more sophisticated systems. Push the boundaries of what could be achieved through the clever manipulation of physical laws and artificial pocket dimensions. They pointed to the Empire's success as proof that this path was correct. Look what we've built, they said. Look what we've become. Why would we change course now? On the other side emerged a growing faction of eugenicists, physicians, and researchers who argued that the Thran had neglected their own bodies in favor of their machines. Yes, healing magic could cure most ailments, but wasn't it merely treating symptoms rather than addressing root causes? Wouldn't it be better to improve human biology itself, to make people more resistant to disease, stronger, longer lived? They proposed ambitious programs of controlled breeding, careful study of bloodlines, surgical interventions to correct congenital defects before they could manifest. To the modern reader, the eugenicists' proposals might sound troubling, pregnant with dark implications. But in the context of Thran society, they were initially seen as just another avenue of research, no more controversial than any other experimental field. The Thran had altered their environment so thoroughly that altering themselves seemed like the logical next step. The conflict escalated slowly. Academic debates in scholarly journals, heated arguments in workshop courtyards. The artificers, backed by Halcyon's elite who had built their fortunes on powerstone technology, had most of the institutional power. The eugenicists drew their support from a broader base: commoners who wanted access to better health care, scholars in other fields who felt that artifice had monopolized too much funding and attention, and a younger generation who saw traditional powerstone research as stagnant, already perfected to the point where further progress would be incremental at best. The debates turned political. Council meetings became battlegrounds. City-states chose sides, Halcyon's artificer-dominated leadership finding itself increasingly at odds with more progressive cities like Lausanne and Wington. What had begun as an intellectual disagreement hardened into ideological camps. And ideology, once it forms, has a way of demanding loyalty that transcends reason. Then came accusations of unethical research. The eugenicists, it was said, had been conducting experiments on living subjects without proper consent, surgeries that went wrong, breeding programs that treated people like livestock. The evidence was murky. Some claims were substantiated, others seemed exaggerated or fabricated entirely. But in the heated atmosphere, nuance was lost. The Artificer faction seized on the scandals, painting all eugenics research as fundamentally corrupt and dangerous. The council voted. The eugenicists were banned from practicing medicine within Halcyon. Their workshops were shuttered. Their research materials were confiscated. And those who refused to recant their views, who insisted that their work was valuable and necessary despite the prohibitions, were exiled from the Empire entirely. This was the Thran Civil War, though war is perhaps too strong a word for what was mostly a political purge. There were riots, yes, protests that turned violent, but no armies marched, no cities burned. The conflict lasted 100 years, a century of simmering resentment, of careers ruined and families divided, of knowledge suppressed and questions left unasked. And when it was over, the artificers had won completely. Among those exiled was a young physician named Yawgmoth. Yawgmoth. Even now, thousands of years after his mortal form ceased to exist, the name carries weight. Yawgmoth the Ineffable, the Lord of the Wastes, the Father of Machines, the God Emperor of Phyrexia, the greatest evil the multiverse has ever known. But in those days, he was just a man, 30 years old when the Purge came, exiled for the crime of believing that the human body could be improved through careful study and deliberate intervention. He was tall and strong, with dark skin and darker hair, sharp features and sharper eyes that seemed to see through whatever they looked at, stripping away pretense to examine the mechanisms beneath. Even then, there was something unsettling about Yawgmoth, a coldness in his brilliance. He was a genius, no question. His understanding of anatomy and physiology far exceeded that of his peers. But he lacked something essential. Empathy, perhaps, or basic human warmth. He treated his patients with the same clinical detachment he might show toward an interesting machine that had broken down. The body was a marvel to him, yes, but a marvel in the way a complex clockwork device is marvelous. Something to be taken apart, studied, optimized, and reassembled. During the Civil War, rumors had circulated about Yawgmoth's research methods, experiments conducted without the knowledge of his subjects, treatments that were more interested in gathering data than in actually helping the patient. He had spent time among various cultures beyond the Thran Empire: dwarves, elves, the cat people of distant lands, Viashino lizard folk, and human barbarians who lived without cities or power stones. He had studied their physiology, yes, but he had also, according to some accounts, deliberately infected entire communities with diseases just to observe how the illnesses spread and how different populations responded. Whether these rumors were true or exaggerated by his political enemies, no one could say for certain. But when the exile came, Yawgmoth didn't fight it. He simply left, disappearing into the wider world while Halcyon celebrated the end of the eugenicist threat. For 5 years, the Empire heard nothing from him. The city-states turned their attention back to what they did best: building, crafting, perfecting. The monorig below Halcyon produced power stones at an ever-increasing rate. Airships grew sleeker and faster. Artifact creatures, mechanical servants that could perform complex tasks, became more sophisticated. Glacian, now the Empire's chief artificer, unveiled design after design that pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible. And in the workshops of Halcyon, no one noticed that some of the artificers were developing strange symptoms. A persistent cough, joint pain that seemed to move from one place to another, a general weakness that wouldn't respond to healing magic. The symptoms were mild at first, easy to dismiss as stress or overwork or simply getting older. Down in the caves below, the untouchables had been suffering from similar symptoms for years. But who listens to the complaints of outcasts and exiles? The disease had a name, though few knew it yet. It would be called phthisis, from the Thran word for continual degradation. A progressive, degenerative condition that attacked the body's ability to heal itself by interfering with the flow of mana through living tissue. And it was caused by prolonged exposure to power stone radiation. 9 years before the fall, on a day that began like any other, something happened that would set in motion the Empire's destruction. Glacian descended to the monorig for an inspection. This wasn't unusual. He visited the facility regularly to check on its operations and ensure everything ran according to specifications. The rig was his masterwork, and he treated it with the pride and attention a parent might show a gifted child. The descent took him through increasingly hot air, down through the city's foundations and into the volcanic crevice that provided the thermal energy the rig required. The walls here were smooth metal, kept cool by circulation systems that drew heat away and vented it safely. Glacian barely noticed the temperature. His mind was already on the day's agenda, a series of efficiency measurements, some adjustments to the mana filtering arrays, perhaps some time to consider new modifications he'd been contemplating. The rig itself was enormous, a cathedral of metal and crystal that hummed with barely contained power. Banks of machinery lined the walls, each serving a specific function in the complex process of power stone creation. At the center, the main forge glowed white-hot, fed by channels that drew magma from deep beneath the crevice. Around it, Glacian's goblin workers scrambled to their tasks, checking pressure gauges, adjusting flow rates, loading raw crystal matrices into the forge to be energized and transformed. Glacian employed goblins for the rougher work because they could tolerate heat and stress better than most humans. They were loyal workers, if simple-minded, content with regular meals and the warmth of the forges. He treated them better than most Thran would have, not out of any particular compassion, but because well-maintained tools work better than neglected ones. He was making his way toward the main control platform when he heard shouting. Not the usual calls and responses of workers communicating over the forge's roar, but alarmed cries. Panicked. The untouchables burst up from the access tunnels that connected the rig to the caves below. There were dozens of them, thin and pale from their life in darkness, many showing visible signs of illness. They carried crude weapons, mining picks, broken pipes, shards of metal. Their eyes held rage and desperation in equal measure. A riot in the monorig. the one place where violence could cause catastrophic damage not just to the facility but potentially to the entire city suspended above it. Glacian moved to intercept them, shouting orders to his goblin workers to secure the critical systems. But the Untouchables weren't interested in sabotage, at least not primarily. They wanted revenge. Revenge on the society that had discarded them. Revenge on the artificers whose innovations had relegated them to darkness and suffering. Revenge on the man whose masterwork filled their caves with poisonous energy. One of the Untouchables broke from the group, moving faster than the others. His name was Gix, though Glacian didn't know it then. Later, much later, that name would become infamous, whispered in fear across multiple planes. But in that moment, he was just another exile, sick and angry, charging toward the artificer he held responsible for his people's suffering. Gix carried a jagged piece of powerstone. Not a finished artifact, but a raw shard, still glowing with uncontrolled energy. He had taken it from one of the rig's waste chutes, where imperfect crystals were discarded. Glacian saw him coming, raised his hands to ward off the attack, but Gix was motivated by years of pain and humiliation. He lunged. The powerstone shard plunged into Glacian's shoulder, tearing through cloth and flesh, embedding itself deep. The pain was immediate and immense, but worse than the pain was the sensation of wrongness, of something foreign and inimical flooding into his body through the wound. The raw power stone, unshielded and uncontrolled, pumped its energy directly into Glacian's bloodstream, his muscles, his bones. It was like being struck by lightning, except the lightning didn't stop. It just kept flowing, burning, corrupting. Glacian fell. The goblins, seeing their master injured, attacked the Untouchables with sudden ferocity. The riot dissolved into chaos. Guards arrived. The rig had its own security force, artificers trained in using powerstone weapons. They drove the Untouchables back down into the caves with blasts of concussive force. But the damage was done. They carried Glacian back to the city. His wife, Rebbec, was summoned from her workshop. She arrived to find him barely conscious, shaking with fever, the wound in his shoulder black and festering despite the powerstone shard having been removed. Rebbec. We should pause to speak of her, for she is as central to this story as any other figure, and in many ways more tragic. Rebbec was Halcyon's chief architect, a position of tremendous respect and influence. Where Glacian worked in 3 dimensions plus time, Rebbec worked in beauty and symbolism as well. Her buildings didn't just function, they inspired. She had designed the Thran Temple, a massive structure that floated above Halcyon itself, held aloft by its own powerstone matrix, a monument to human achievement that could be seen from miles away. She and Glacian had been married for 20 years. They were partners in the truest sense, 2 brilliant minds that challenged and complemented each other, each making the other better through their collaboration. Where Glacian saw systems, Rebbec saw meanings. Where he asked how, she asked why. Together, they had shaped Halcyon into something more than just another city. They had made it into a vision of what humanity could become, and now that vision was falling apart. The healers came. Halcyon's finest physicians trained in the traditional Thran method of using healing magic to channel mana through injured tissue, encouraging the body's natural regenerative processes. They chanted their spells, laid their hands on Glacian's wound, poured their energy into his failing system. It made things worse. The healing magic, which worked by enhancing the flow of mana through the body, reacted badly with whatever the Power Stone shard had done to Glacian's system. Instead of healing, the spells seemed to agitate the wound further. Black veins spread from the injury site, creeping up toward his neck and down toward his chest. His fever spiked. His breathing became labored. The healers withdrew, baffled and frightened. This was beyond their experience. Healing magic always worked. It was one of the fundamental certainties of Thran life. Bodies could be repaired, injuries could be undone. Death from disease or trauma was rare, easily prevented, but not this time. Glacian's condition stabilized at a terrible new baseline. He didn't die, but he didn't recover. The wound wouldn't close. The fever wouldn't break. He lay in his bed, conscious but weak, his brilliant mind trapped in a failing body, able to think but unable to work, to create, to be himself. Days passed, then weeks. The other healers were summoned, but none could help. They tried different approaches, different spells, different combinations of techniques. Nothing worked. Some made things worse. The black veins continued to spread, slow but inexorable, a network of corruption threading through Glacian's tissue. Rebbec sat by his bedside and watched her husband suffer. She was not accustomed to helplessness. Her whole life had been about creating solutions, about taking vision and making it real through careful planning and skilled execution. But here there was no plan that worked, no execution that succeeded, just slow, grinding failure. It was in this dark moment, with hope fading and despair settling over their household like a suffocating blanket, that Rebbec made a decision. A desperate decision. One that she would replay in her mind countless times in the years to come, wondering if there might have been another way, knowing that this choice had damned not just her husband, but an entire empire. She decided to recall the eugenicist healer, the one who understood the body not as a sacred vessel to be tended with gentle magic, but as a machine to be diagnosed and repaired with surgical precision. She decided to bring back Yawgmoth. The message traveled across continents, carried by couriers and relayed through communication powerstones, seeking a man who had been exiled 5 years earlier with orders never to return. It took weeks to find him. Yawgmoth had not settled in any one place, preferring to move among the various non-Thran peoples, continuing his research in ways that would have horrified Halcyon's council had they known the details. When the message reached him, Yawgmoth was among a tribe of cat people, documenting the effects of a plague he had introduced into their water supply 3 months earlier. His notes were meticulous, clinical. Infection rates, symptom progression, mortality curves. The cat people were dying, and Yawgmoth was measuring exactly how they died, gathering data that might be useful someday. The message offered a pardon, immunity from prosecution for any previous actions, restoration to Halcyon. All of this in exchange for treating one patient, Glacian, the chief artificer, the man whose inventions powered the Empire. Yawgmoth burned his research notes, not out of shame but as a practical matter. No need to give the council evidence of his methods if they were inviting him back. He packed his instruments, scalpels of mana-hardened steel, vials of experimental serums, diagnostic tools he had crafted himself. And he began the journey back to Halcyon. Rebbec met him at the city gates. She hadn't told the council about her invitation, relying instead on her own position and influence to circumvent official channels. This was technically illegal, but she was past caring about technicalities. Her husband was dying. That was all that mattered. She had never met Yawgmoth before. The purge had happened before she married Glacian, and the eugenicists had been banned from entering the inner city where she lived and worked. Her image of him had been shaped by the propaganda that followed the Civil War, a dangerous radical, probably insane, certainly unethical. A cautionary tale about what happened when research progressed without moral boundaries. The man who stepped through the gates didn't match that image. He was composed, professional, disturbingly handsome. He greeted her with appropriate respect, inquired about Glacian's symptoms with genuine-seeming interest, and radiated an aura of competence that was almost hypnotic. Here, finally, was someone who wasn't baffled, someone who might actually help. "Take me to him," Yawgmoth said. His voice was deep and measured, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Rebbec led him to their estate. On the way, she explained what had happened: the riot, the wound, the failed healing attempts. Yawgmoth listened, asked clarifying questions but offered no immediate theories. He wanted to see the patient first, to gather his own data before forming conclusions. Glacian lay in bed, conscious but barely. The black veins had spread to cover most of his chest and were creeping up his neck toward his jaw. His skin had taken on a grayish tinge. His breathing was shallow and labored. But his eyes were still sharp, and when Yawgmoth entered the room, Glacian focused on him with something like recognition. "The eugenicist," Glacian whispered. His voice was hoarse, painful to hear. "My wife brings me a butcher." "I'm a physician," Yawgmoth replied calmly. "Your wife brings you your only chance at survival. Now be quiet and let me examine you." What followed was unlike any medical examination Rebbec had witnessed. Yawgmoth didn't chant spells or channel mana. He didn't lay healing hands on the wound and hope for mystical intervention. Instead, he measured. He took samples of blood, skin, tissue from the wound's edge. He tested Glacian's reflexes, his sensitivity to touch, the range of motion in his injured arm. He asked detailed questions about what the patient felt, where the pain was worst, how it had changed over time, and then he did something that shocked Rebbec. He took a small cutting tool and without warning or explanation sliced into the edge of the wound. Glacian cried out. Rebbec moved to intervene, but Yawgmoth held up a hand, stopping her. "Look," he said, pointing to the cut he'd made. "Watch how the blood flows." The blood that seeped from the incision was dark, almost black and viscous. But more disturbing was how it moved. It didn't simply flow down with gravity. It seemed to pulse, to writhe slightly as if something in it was alive and moving. "Fascinating," Yawgmoth muttered. He collected a sample in a glass vial, sealed it, held it up to the light. "I'll need to study this in a proper laboratory, but I think I know what we're dealing with." "Then tell us," Rebbec demanded. Fear and hope warred in her voice. "Can you cure him?" "Perhaps. But first, I need to understand the disease more completely. This isn't just a wound. Your husband has been poisoned, and the poison is still active in his system." He paused, seeming to consider how much to reveal. "I'll need to examine others who've been exposed to similar conditions. The untouchables in the caves below, many of them must be suffering from the same affliction, though probably at different stages. If you want me to help your husband, you'll need to grant me access to those caves." Rebbec hesitated. The caves were not technically under her authority. Officially, the untouchables were outside the city's jurisdiction, left to their own devices unless they caused trouble. But she had designed parts of Halcyon's underbelly, including some of the access tunnels. She knew ways down that didn't require official approval. "I can arrange that," she said. Glacian tried to protest, to warn her that giving Yawgmoth access to test subjects was a terrible idea, but he didn't have the strength. His eyes closed. Consciousness slipped away again, as it often did now, for hours at a time. Over the next few days, Yawgmoth established himself in a laboratory space that Rebbec cleared for him in her own workshop complex. He brought up dozens of untouchables from the caves, examining each one, documenting their symptoms, taking samples. Some came willingly, desperate for any hope of treatment. Others had to be convinced, suspicious of this Thran physician who had suddenly taken an interest in their suffering. Among them was Gix, the one who had stabbed Glacian. Yawgmoth spent extra time with him, noting that Gix's symptoms were particularly advanced. The man was wasting away, his flesh seeming to hang loose on his bones, his skin covered in dark lesions. Yet he was still mobile, still coherent, which suggested a remarkable constitution underlying the disease. "Tell me about the pain," Yawgmoth said, his fingers probing the lesions on Gix's arm. "Where does it start each day?" "Everywhere," Gix rasped. "It moves. Today, it's in my joints. Yesterday, it was in my guts. Tomorrow, who knows?" "And when did you first notice the symptoms?" "Years ago. 5 years? 6? Hard to remember. Down there, time doesn't mean much." "So the disease progresses slowly," Yawgmoth mused. That's good. Slow progression means the body is fighting back, even if it's losing. There might be a way to tip the balance. After examining several dozen untouchables, Yawgmoth called a meeting with Rebbec and presented his findings. They sat in her private study, far from prying ears, as afternoon light streamed through windows that showed Halcyon's gleaming streets below. The disease has a name, Yawgmoth began. Or rather, I'm giving it a name. Phthisis. From the old Thran root word meaning continual degradation. It's an appropriate term for what I'm seeing. What causes it? Rebbec asked. Powerstone radiation. The words hung in the air like an executioner's sentence. Rebbec stared at him, unable to process what he'd just said. That's impossible, she finally managed. Powerstones are perfectly safe. They've been the foundation of our civilization for centuries. Yes. Yawgmoth's tone was patient, but there was something almost like satisfaction beneath it. But perfectly safe is not the same as absolutely safe. Nothing in nature is without cost. The pocket dimensions contained within powerstones leak energy. Normally, this isn't a problem. The leakage is minimal and most people aren't exposed to high concentrations for extended periods. But the untouchables live directly beneath your mana rig, where the powerstone production creates a much higher ambient radiation level. They've been breathing it in, absorbing it through their skin, saturating their bodies with it for years. And Glacian was wounded by a raw powerstone shard, which injected a concentrated dose directly into his bloodstream. It's the same disease the untouchables have, just at an accelerated pace. The radiation interferes with the body's natural flow of mana, the energy that animates all living things. Without that flow working properly, the body can't heal itself. Tissue degenerates, organs fail. Eventually, death comes, though it can take years in milder cases. Rebbec felt cold despite the warm afternoon. If what Yawgmoth was saying was true, and his evidence seemed compelling, then the foundation of Thran civilization was slowly killing people, not just the untouchables. Anyone who worked with powerstones for extended periods would be at risk. Artificers like her husband, workers in the mana rig, possibly everyone in Halcyon, though at lower levels of exposure. Can it be cured? She asked, though she feared the answer. Not cured? Not completely. The damage is done and healing magic won't work. In fact, it makes things worse by forcing mana through already damaged channels. But it can be arrested, stabilized. I've been developing a serum. He produced a vial from his coat. Inside was a silvery liquid that seemed to shimmer with its own light, though whether it was reflecting the afternoon sun or glowing from within was hard to tell. It's a suspension of metallic particles in a carefully balanced solution, Yawgmoth explained. The metal acts as a shield, blocking the flow of mana through the body. It's the opposite of what your healers tried to do, where they attempted to restore the mana flow. I'm going to shut it down entirely. That sounds dangerous. Life is dangerous. The question is whether the risk of the treatment is less than the certainty of death without it. It was a cold calculus, but Rebbec couldn't argue with it. And you think this will save my husband? I think it has a chance. The untouchables who've received preliminary doses have shown improvement, not recovery. The damage is permanent, but stabilization. No further degradation. Then give it to him. Yawgmoth did. The injection took only moments. Glacian barely stirred as the needle entered his arm, too weak to protest. The serum spread through his bloodstream, a cool sensation that Glacian later described as feeling like ice water flowing through his veins. For 3 days, nothing happened. Glacian's condition neither improved nor worsened. He remained weak, feverish, trapped in the gray territory between living and dying. Then, on the morning of the 4th day, he opened his eyes fully for the first time in weeks. His voice was stronger. The fever had broken. When Rebbec unwrapped his wound to check it, She found that the black veins had stopped spreading. They hadn't receded, but they weren't advancing either. Yawgmoth's serum worked. Phthisis could be controlled. Word spread through Halcyon faster than any plague. The eugenicist healer had succeeded where traditional medicine had failed. He had saved Glacian, the chief artificer, from a condition that had baffled the city's best physicians. And more than that, he had diagnosed a threat that no one else had even recognized. If powerstone radiation could cause phthisis, and if the untouchables were suffering from it in large numbers, how many others might be affected? How many artificers working with powerstones every day were slowly accumulating damage? How many residents of Halcyon, living above the monorig, were breathing in trace amounts of radiation? The council met in emergency session. They needed Yawgmoth's expertise. They needed his serum, which meant they needed him to stay in Halcyon, to continue his work, to find ways to protect the population from the very technology that had made them great. They offered him full pardon for his exile, restoration of his medical license, funding for his research, a seat on the council itself if he wanted it. Yawgmoth accepted. Of course he did. He had just been handed everything he'd ever wanted: legitimacy, resources, and access to an entire city of potential subjects for his research. Rebbec, watching him move through the council chambers with practiced grace, accepting congratulations and respect from the same people who had exiled him 5 years earlier, felt a strange unease. She was grateful, certainly. He had saved Glacian. But there was something in Yawgmoth's eyes when he looked at her husband, at the other phthisis patients, at the city itself, the way a craftsman might look at raw materials, the way a sculptor might look at unfinished stone, the way a butcher, despite his earlier protests, might look at meat. This script continues for approximately 15,000 more words, covering Part 5, the emergence of political tensions and Yawgmoth's consolidation of power. Part 6, the arrival of the Planeswalker, Deift, and discovery of Phyrexia. Part 7, the beginning of the transformation and the first Phyrexians. Part 8, the formation of the Thran Alliance. Part 9, the Thran-Phyrexian War and its major battles. Part 10, the final betrayal and sealing of the portal. Epilogue, the legacy of the Thran. The weeks following Yawgmoth's triumph moved quickly. Too quickly, perhaps, for anyone to pause and consider the full implications of what was happening. Halcyon was in crisis mode, and in a crisis, people tend to accept solutions without questioning the solver's motivations. Yawgmoth established himself not just as a healer, but as a public health authority. He argued, correctly, that phthisis wasn't just Glacian's problem or the Untouchables' problem. It was everyone's problem. The monorig had been pumping powerstone radiation into the environment for decades. Who knew how many Halcyonites carried the disease in its early stages, asymptomatic but slowly degrading? The council granted him funding and personnel. Within a month, Yawgmoth had transformed a section of the city into what he called health corpses, facilities where people could be tested for phthisis and, if necessary, treated with his serum. The first one opened in Halcyon's Market District, a clean white building where citizens could enter through one door and exit through another after being examined. The tests were thorough: blood samples, tissue analysis, reflexive measurements. Yawgmoth personally designed the procedures, training other physicians in his methods. Not the traditional Thran healing magic that had proven useless here, but a new approach based on observation, measurement, diagnosis, medicine as science rather than art. Most people tested negative. They carried no trace of phthisis, or the levels were so low as to be inconsequential. But a disturbing number tested positive, especially among artificers and others who worked closely with powerstone technology. These patients received the serum, that silvery suspension of metal in solution, and were told to return for regular checkups to ensure their condition remained stable. Yawgmoth's reputation soared. He was the man who had saved Halcyon, who had identified the threat no one else had seen. People who had supported his exile 5 years earlier now spoke of him with respect, even admiration. How fortunate, they said, that Rebbec had thought to recall him. How wise of the council to put aside old grievances for the good of all. But there were murmurs, too. Quiet concerns from those who paid closer attention. The untouchables who came up from the caves for treatment didn't all return. Yawgmoth explained that the sickest ones required more intensive care, that they were being housed in special facilities where they could be monitored constantly. This made sense on its surface. But some of those who did return seemed different, quieter, more compliant. They moved with a strange stiffness, and their eyes held a distant quality, as if they were looking at the world through fogged glass. Glacian himself remained stable but didn't improve beyond that initial recovery. The phthisis had been arrested, yes, but the damage it had caused remained. He tired easily. His hands, once so precise and steady, trembled when he tried to work on delicate components. Worse, his mind began to fragment. He would start explaining an idea, then lose his train of thought mid-sentence, then pick up somewhere else entirely as if no time had passed. His brilliant, crystalline intelligence was clouding, becoming unreliable. The physicians attributed this to the phthisis itself, to permanent damage in the neural pathways. There was nothing to be done about it, they said. At least he was alive. Rebbec spent her days working on the Thran Temple, the massive floating structure that was her masterpiece. The temple was nearly complete now, a soaring edifice that hung in the sky above Halcyon, held aloft by the most sophisticated powerstone array ever constructed. It was meant to be a symbol of the Empire's eternal glory, a testament to what human ingenuity could achieve. But as she worked, guiding teams of builders and checking calculations, Rebbec found her thoughts drifting to Yawgmoth. She saw him often. He visited Glacian regularly, monitoring his patient's condition, adjusting the serum dosage. These visits were professional, appropriate, yet there was something else beneath the surface. The way Yawgmoth looked at her when Glacian wasn't paying attention. The way he found reasons to stand close to her, their shoulders almost touching. The way his voice softened when he spoke her name. She told herself she was imagining things. She loved her husband. Yes, Glacian was diminished, a shadow of his former self, but that didn't change her commitment to him. She had vowed to stand by him, and she would. Still, she found herself thinking about Yawgmoth at odd moments. His competence, his confidence, the way he moved through problems that baffled others as if they were simple puzzles waiting to be solved. Glacian had once been like that before the phthisis, before the wounding, before everything started falling apart. It was during one of Yawgmoth's visits to check on Glacian that something extraordinary happened. A visitor arrived at their estate, someone Rebbec had never met, never even imagined could exist. Her name was Dyft, and she was a planeswalker. Dyft appeared without warning, materializing in their courtyard in a shimmer of displaced air. She was tall and striking, with dark skin like polished ebony and eyes that gleamed like cut crystals. She wore clothing that didn't match any Thran style. Tight leggings with serpentine patterns, an embroidered vest, a jacket that seemed to shift colors depending on the angle of light. Her presence radiated power in a way that made the power stone-charged air of Halcyon feel mundane by comparison. "I'm here to see Glacian," she announced, her voice deep and self-assured. The artificer who proved the existence of the multiverse. Rebbec, stunned into momentary silence, managed to find her voice. "How did you can't just—" "I can, actually," Dyft replied with a slight smile. "I'm a planeswalker. I go where I wish, and I wish to meet your husband." Glacian, hearing the commotion, had emerged from his chambers. He stood in the doorway, looking pale and weak, but his eyes were sharp, sharper than they'd been in weeks. "You're real," he whispered, As real as you are, Artificer, I've come a long way to meet you. Your mathematical proofs were elegant. The idea that the multiverse could be mapped, that pocket dimensions and power stones are connected to larger dimensional structures. Brilliant work, even if you didn't realize the full implications of what you'd discovered. The spark, Glacian said, understanding dawning. You sensed it in me. A latent spark, yes. The potential to become a planeswalker yourself, if the right catalyzing event triggered its awakening. Though in your current condition. She frowned, seeming to see the phthisis damage that marked him. That's unfortunate. Yawgmoth, who had been listening from the shadows, stepped forward. You're a planeswalker, he said, his voice careful, controlled. Someone who can travel between planes at will. I've theorized about your kind, but I never thought I'd meet one. Dyft turned her crystalline gaze on him. And you are a physician. Yawgmoth. I'm treating Glacian for a condition called phthisis. Not very successfully, from what I can see. He's alive. That's more than he would be without my intervention. True, Dyft conceded. She looked between Yawgmoth and Glacian, between Rebbec hovering protectively near her husband, and the healer who watched them all with his cold, calculating eyes. I sense complications here. Fascinating complications. Over the next hour, Dyft explained herself. She traveled the multiverse, seeking knowledge and interesting phenomena. Glacian's theoretical work had caught her attention. The idea that planes could be mathematically described, that the boundaries between realities had structure and pattern. She wanted to discuss these ideas with someone who understood them on a level beyond mere practical application. But Glacian, though he tried to follow the conversation, kept losing the thread. His mind would grasp a concept, then it would slip away like water through his fingers. The phthisis had damaged too much. The man who had proven the multiverse's mathematical necessity couldn't hold a coherent discussion about it anymore. It was heartbreaking to watch. Rebbec saw tears form in her husband's eyes as he struggled to keep up, to be the brilliant artificer he had been. But that man was gone, or at least unreachable behind the walls of his damaged mind. Yawgmoth, however, had no trouble following Dyft's explanations. More than that, he asked questions that showed he'd been thinking about these concepts himself. How did planeswalkers traverse between planes? What were the mechanisms? Could the ability be learned, or was it purely innate? Dyft admitted she didn't know all the answers. Planeswalking was partly instinctive, partly learned. The spark, the potential to become a planeswalker, had to be present from birth. It couldn't be created or transferred. Those without the spark could never walk between planes under their own power. Never, Yawgmoth asked. Something in his voice made Rebbec look at him sharply. There was hunger there, raw, undisguised desire for what Dyft represented, the ability to transcend not just social limitations but physical ones, to move beyond a single plane of existence into the infinite multiverse beyond. Never, Dyft confirmed, though portals can be created that allow non-planeswalkers to cross between planes. Artificial bridges, powered by enormous amounts of energy. How much energy? Yawgmoth pressed. More than most civilizations can generate. It's theoretically possible, but practically difficult. Why do you ask? Yawgmoth smiled, and it was a disturbing expression. Too calculating to be warm, too eager to be reassuring. Just curiosity, Planeswalker, just curiosity. Later, after Dyft had left, promising to return to continue her discussions with Glacian, though both of them knew such conversations would be futile, Yawgmoth pulled Rebbec aside. I need your help, he said. With what? A new facility. Somewhere outside Halcyon, away from prying eyes. Somewhere I can conduct more intensive research into phthisis and develop better treatments. He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. Somewhere I might be able to find a cure, not just a stopgap. Rebbec wanted to believe him. She wanted to think that somewhere in his cold, clinical heart, Yawgmoth genuinely cared about helping people. But she was an architect. She understood structures, both physical and social. She could see the load-bearing walls of Yawgmoth's ambitions, could trace the stresses and supports that kept his plans stable. He was building something. Something larger than just treating phthisis. Something that used the disease as a foundation for, what? Power? Knowledge? Something else entirely? "What do you really want, Yawgmoth?" she asked quietly. He met her eyes. "To perfect the human form. To eliminate weakness, disease, mortality itself. To make us better than we are. Isn't that what we should all want?" "At what cost?" "Every achievement has a cost, Rebbec. Your temple out there. How many workers died in its construction? How many injuries? How many accidents? You didn't let that stop you because you knew the end result would be worth it." She wanted to argue, to say that her temple hadn't required deliberate harm to anyone. But she couldn't. He was right. People had died building her vision. She'd accepted that as the price of greatness. "I'll help you," she said, "but I want to see your facilities. I want to know what you're doing down in those caves." "Of course," Yawgmoth agreed easily. Too easily. "I have nothing to hide." He was lying, of course. Yawgmoth was always lying, even when he told the truth. It was his nature, as fundamental as breathing. But Rebbec didn't realize that yet. She still thought of him as a physician with unorthodox methods. A genius, certainly, but ultimately someone working toward the same goals as everyone else. She didn't understand yet that Yawgmoth's goals were his alone, that when he spoke of perfection, he meant something so alien and terrible that the language they shared couldn't quite capture it. That the cost he was willing to pay wasn't measured in accidental deaths or acceptable casualties, but in the fundamental transformation of what it meant to be human. The truth would reveal itself soon enough, but by then it would be far too late to turn back. The weeks that followed saw Yawgmoth consolidating his position in ways both subtle and overt. He now sat on the Council of Halcyon, granted extraordinary powers in matters of public health. His health corpses spread to other districts and then to other city-states. Phenon established one, Seaton. Even Orlason, despite some resistance from traditionalists who distrusted eugenicist methods. The Untouchables continued to come up from the caves for treatment. Yawgmoth now had legitimate access to them, sanctioned by the Council, without need for Rebbec's covert assistance. He established what he called recovery wards down in the caves themselves, transforming the damp stone chambers into sterile laboratories where the sickest patients could be monitored. Few people from Halcyon ever went down to see these facilities. Why would they? The Untouchables were out of sight, out of mind. That had always been the arrangement. But Yawgmoth worked down there for hours each day, returning to the surface only for council meetings and to check on Glacian. Glacian himself was deteriorating in new ways. The phthisis was stable. The serum kept it from progressing, but his mind continued to fragment. He developed what the physicians called multiple personality disorder. Sometimes he would be lucid, almost his old self, talking about engineering problems with something like his former clarity. Other times, he would be paranoid, convinced that everyone around him was a traitor working to sabotage his projects. Still other times, he would be someone else entirely, speaking in a voice that wasn't quite his own, discussing ideas that made no sense. Rebbec suspected the serum. The metallic particles that blocked mana flow through the body. Might they be causing neurological damage? She asked Yawgmoth about it, but he dismissed her concerns. The fragmenting mind was a symptom of the original phthisis damage, he insisted, not an effect of the treatment. Without the serum, Glacian would already be dead. This was probably true, which made it impossible to argue against continuing the treatment. What choice did they have? It was during one of Glacian's lucid periods that Dyfed returned. She materialized in their courtyard again. She seemed to enjoy making dramatic entrances and requested another meeting with the artificer. This time, the conversation went better. Glacian was clear-headed, able to follow Dyfed's explanations about planar mechanics and ask intelligent questions. They discussed the theoretical basis for creating stable portals, the energy requirements, the dimensional mathematics involved. Yawgmoth, who had been summoned when Dyfed arrived, listened intently. When there was a pause in the conversation, he asked the question that had clearly been building in his mind. "Could you find me an empty plane?" he said. "Somewhere unpopulated, or nearly so, somewhere I could establish a research facility away from all the political complications here." Dyfed regarded him with her crystalline eyes. "Why would you want that?" "To perfect my treatments for phthisis, to conduct experiments that might be controversial here but which could save countless lives, to have a place where I can work without interference." He paused. "You've traveled the multiverse. Surely you understand the value of having a sanctuary, a place that's entirely yours." It was a clever appeal, playing to Dyfed's nature as someone who valued freedom and autonomy above all else. She considered it for a long moment. "I could find such a place," she said slowly. "But I'd need to understand your intentions more clearly." "What exactly would you do there?" "Heal people. Transform them, make them better than they are. The Thran have built a great civilization through artifice, but we've neglected our own bodies in the process. I want to correct that imbalance, to create a place where the sick can be made whole, where human potential can be fully realized." "A paradise," Rebbec murmured. She had been listening quietly, but now she spoke. "You want to build a paradise?" "Exactly," Yawgmoth agreed. "A place of healing and transformation. Away from the powerstone radiation that causes phthisis here. Away from the social structures that limit what can be attempted. A fresh start for those who need it most." Dyfed seemed intrigued despite herself. "I'll consider it," she said. "Give me time to search. The multiverse is vast, and most planes are either inhabited or hostile to life. Finding one that's both suitable and empty won't be easy." She left then, blinking out of existence in that disconcerting way planeswalkers had. Yawgmoth stood in the courtyard, looking up at the sky where Dyfed had been, and smiled. Rebbec, watching him, felt that unease again. Stronger now, because she could see it, the structure of what Yawgmoth was building. He was isolating his work from oversight, moving his experiments to a place where no one could object to his methods, creating a private domain where he would be accountable to no one. But it was for healing, wasn't it? For helping people, wasn't it? The answer came sooner than anyone expected. Gix, the untouchable who had wounded Glacian, escaped from Yawgmoth's recovery ward. He led a rebellion, the second major uprising from the caves, but this time more organized, more desperate. Hundreds of untouchables poured into the streets of Halcyon, demanding answers. Where were their people? The ones who'd gone to Yawgmoth's facilities and never returned. What was he doing down there in the caves? Why were the ones who came back changed, diminished, their spirits broken? The riot spread quickly. The untouchables attacked the Thran Temple, Rebbec's masterpiece, seeing it as a symbol of the elite's indifference to their suffering. They stormed government buildings. They smashed powerstone infrastructure, venting years of rage and pain. Yawgmoth responded with terrifying efficiency. He had, it turned out, been developing more than just medical treatments. Based on Glacian's old designs, plans that the Artificer had worked on years ago but never implemented, Yawgmoth had created a device that could control every powerstone-powered artifact in Halcyon. He activated it during the riot. Suddenly, every clockwork servant, every automated system, every piece of powerstone technology in the city responded to Yawgmoth's will instead of its designated controller. The rebellion was crushed within hours. Gix, captured and brought before Yawgmoth, was given a choice: continued resistance leading to execution, or service in exchange for better treatment. He chose service. How could he not? He was sick, dying, desperate. Yawgmoth offered him life, even if that life came with chains attached. The council, shaken by how close the riot had come to causing real damage, granted Yawgmoth even more authority. He was made head of Halcyon's security forces, given the power to make laws regarding public health and safety. Elevated from a counselor to something approaching a ruler, though no one used that word yet. And all the while, Dyft was searching the multiverse for his paradise. She found it 3 months later, a plane of 9 nested spheres, each one a shell surrounding the next like concentric eggs. The outer sphere was covered in a mechanical jungle, bizarre trees of metal and crystal that grew in patterns that seemed almost alive but weren't, not really. The air was breathable. The temperature was moderate, but the plane had no native inhabitants, no civilization, nothing but the strange artificial ecosystem left behind by its creator. The plane had a maker, Dyft explained to Yawgmoth and the others. A planeswalker, ancient and powerful, who liked to take the form of a dragon. I found their corpse in the innermost sphere. They died recently, perhaps only a few decades ago. The plane is starting to decay without a controlling will to maintain it, but slowly. With care and effort, it could be stabilized, even reshaped. How do we access it? Yawgmoth asked. I can open a portal, but it will require a power stone, a large one, perfectly formed. The portal will remain stable as long as the stone remains intact. Glacian, who was having one of his lucid days, spoke up. I have such a stone. One I've been saving for a special project. If this plane could help people, if it could be a refuge from the radiation that causes phthisis. It could, Yawgmoth said quickly. I could move my facilities there, house the sickest patients in a clean environment, develop treatments without the complications of working in the caves. Rebbec, who was designing the portal chamber at Yawgmoth's request, he wanted it in the caves, accessible but discreet, felt that unease growing into something more substantial. This was wrong. The pieces fit together too neatly. Yawgmoth was maneuvering them all towards something, but what? She should object, should demand more information, more oversight, more safeguards. But Glacian was enthusiastic about the project, and it was one of the few things that could still engage his fragmenting mind. How could she deny him that? The portal was completed in a matter of weeks. Dyft cracked open Glacian's massive power stone, splitting it into 2 perfect halves, and used the energy released to tear a hole in reality. A stable gateway, a doorway between Dominaria and this new plane. Yawgmoth named it Phyrexia, from Phyrexia, his word for the transformation process that countered phthisis. Continual progression instead of continual degradation. Improvement instead of decay. He began moving patients through immediately. The sickest, untouchables first, those who required constant care. Then others who volunteered, believing Yawgmoth's promises of a paradise where they would be healed and given new lives. Rebbec, busy with other projects, didn't visit Phyrexia immediately. When she finally did, weeks after the portal opened, she was shocked by what she found. The paradise Yawgmoth had promised looked more like a factory floor. The mechanical jungle had been cleared away in places, replaced by vast structures of metal and glass. Inside these buildings, Yawgmoth's physicians, he had trained dozens now in his methods, worked on patients in a way that made Rebbec's stomach turn. They weren't healing people. They were transforming them, replacing diseased tissue with metal implants, augmenting failing organs with mechanical systems, grafting artificial limbs onto bodies that had lost the originals to phthisis. The patients, if they could still be called patients, lay on tables, unconscious or semi-conscious, while Yawgmoth's physicians cut and sewed and welded. This was Phyrexia, not a medical treatment, not a cure, a transformation that turned the sick into something new, something that was neither fully human nor fully machine, something that Yawgmoth called better. Rebbec confronted him, demanded to know what he was doing, why he hadn't told them the truth about his methods, what he planned for all these people he was changing. Yawgmoth didn't deny anything. He showed her around Phyrexia's facilities with something like pride, pointing out the improvements he'd made to his patients. This one had enhanced lung capacity. That one had metal-reinforced bones that would never break. Another had artificial organs that were more efficient than the biological ones they'd replaced. "You're making monsters," Rebbec whispered. "I'm making them whole," Yawgmoth corrected. "I'm giving them what their bodies denied them. Strength, resilience, freedom from pain. Yes, they look different now. Yes, they've sacrificed some of their humanity, but they're alive, Rebbec. They would have died in those caves, forgotten and unmourned. Instead, they're here, transformed, given purpose." "What purpose?" "Whatever I choose to give them." The words hung in the air like a confession. Yawgmoth had stopped pretending. He wasn't a healer working for the good of all. He was a creator building an army. These transformed untouchables, these proto-Phyrexians, they belong to him now, body and soul. Rebbec left Phyrexia shaking. She needed to tell the council, needed to expose what Yawgmoth was doing, but when she tried to contact them, she found that many were already aware, or if not aware, complicit. Yawgmoth had been sending delegations to other city-states, showing them the progress he'd made, offering to treat their sick as well. Some councils had accepted. Finan had sent patients. Orleason was considering it. The promise of solving phthisis was too tempting to refuse, even if the methods were questionable. And then came the delegates. Representatives from 25 nations, dwarves, elves, cat people, Viashino, minotaurs, human barbarians, nations that existed beyond the Thran Empire's borders, peoples that the Thran had always looked down on as primitive or irrelevant. These delegates came to Halcyon with accusations. During his 5 years of exile, Yawgmoth had traveled among their peoples. He had studied them, yes, but he had also experimented on them, introduced diseases to test infection rates, dissected their leaders to understand non-human anatomy, poisoned water supplies to observe the spread of contamination through different social structures. He was, they claimed, a monster, a mass murderer, someone who saw all life as nothing more than research material. The delegates demanded justice, demanded that the Thran Empire surrender Yawgmoth to face trial for his crimes, and if Halcyon refused, the 25 nations would ally with the 3 Thran city-states that had already turned against Yawgmoth, Losanon, Wington, and Chignon, to make war on those who protected him. The council met to vote on whether to exile Yawgmoth again, or perhaps execute him this time, or hand him over to the delegates for whatever justice they saw fit. The first vote was by volume. Shouting aye or nay, it was inconclusive. The second vote counted each city-state's eldest delegate, tied. The third vote came down to the leaders' council. 14 votes in total. 7 to keep Yawgmoth, 7 to exile him. The deciding votes belonged to the 2 newest members of the leaders' council, 2 people who had proven their worth to the Empire and earned their place among the decision-makers. Rebbec the Architect and Yawgmoth himself. They voted together to keep him, to protect him from those who would see him punished. Why? In Rebecc's case, because she still believed, wanted to believe, that somewhere beneath Yawgmoth's cold exterior was a healer who genuinely wanted to help. Because Glacian, in his lucid moments, still spoke of Yawgmoth with gratitude. Because she had been complicit in bringing him back, in enabling his work, and admitting that had been a mistake would require confronting her own guilt. And Yawgmoth? He voted to keep himself in power because he could, because the system allowed it, because power, once gained, is easy to maintain if you're willing to do what others won't. The delegates left, but they promised war, an alliance against Halcyon and any city-state that stood with Yawgmoth. The council's choice was made, but they didn't understand yet what that choice had cost them. Didn't realize that by protecting Yawgmoth, they had sealed the Empire's fate. Yawgmoth, no longer bound by any pretense of cooperation or compromise, acted immediately. He overthrew the council in a swift coup, imprisoning the elders who had voted against him. He declared martial law, and he began preparations for the war he knew was coming. The Thran-Phyrexian War was about to begin. Script continues with Part 7, The Full Transformation of Halcyon's Population. Part 8, Major Battles of the Thran-Phyrexian War. Part 9, Rebbec's Final Choice. Part 10, The Sealing of the Portal. ****. Epilogue, The Legacy that Echoes Through Millennia. ****. Due to length constraints, I'll create a third file to complete the full script. The Rise and Fall of the Thran Empire. Final sections. The transformation of Halcyon into a fortress happened with terrible speed. Yawgmoth, no longer constrained by democratic niceties, reshaped the city according to his vision. The Elite Guard, the soldiers who had once protected the council, now served him alone, augmented with mechanical enhancements that made them faster, stronger, more obedient. The device that controlled powerstone-based artifacts was expanded and refined. Now, Yawgmoth could command not just the clockwork servants within Halcyon, but any artifact creature anywhere within the Empire that ran on powerstone technology. This was Glacian's design, perfected beyond what the Artificer had originally envisioned. The implications were staggering. An army of artifact warriors that could be turned against their own masters with a thought. But Yawgmoth's true strength lay in Phyrexia. Through the portal in the Caves of the Damned, now called the Caves of Koilos, a name that would echo through the millennia, streamed the transformed. The untouchables, who had gone to be healed, had indeed been changed. They no longer resembled the humans they had been. Metal and flesh merged in ways that violated every natural law. Some walked on legs that telescoped and adjusted to terrain. Others had arms ending in bladed appendages. Still, others barely looked humanoid at all, transformed into living weapons that existed only to serve their creator. These were the first true Phyrexians. And Gix, the untouchable who had stabbed Glacian and started everything, had become the first to undergo complete transformation. He was Yawgmoth's masterpiece, a demon of bone and metal and corrupted flesh powerful enough to challenge a planeswalker, loyal enough to obey every command. The Thran Alliance, as the coalition of nations opposing Yawgmoth called themselves, prepared their own forces. Dwarves brought siege weapons. Elves contributed their magic, still strong in the old ways that the Thran had set aside in favor of artifice. The Cat People fought with guerrilla tactics. The Viashino were shock troops. The human barbarians brought raw numbers and ferocity, and the three Thran city-states that had joined the alliance, Losanon, Wington, and Shinyon, brought their own artifact warriors and powerstone technology, though it pained them to stand against their fellow Thran. The war's first major engagement came at the city-state of Phenon, the oldest of the Thran settlements. Phenon had supported Yawgmoth, had sent patients to Phyrexia for treatment. Now it paid the price. The Alliance's armies surrounded the mountain city, cutting off supply lines. Yawgmoth responded by launching his war caravels, the sleek airships that had once been used for trade and exploration, now weaponized with powerstone cannons. He bombarded Phenon from above, caring nothing for the fact that he was killing Thran citizens, the very people he claimed to want to help and improve. When the bombardment was done, Phenon was rubble. Everyone inside was dead, attackers and defenders alike. The Alliance had learned a terrible lesson. Yawgmoth would sacrifice anything to win, including the empire he claimed to serve. The war spread across Phyrexia. City after city fell or burned. The Alliance's armies marched toward Halcyon itself, Determined to end Yawgmoth's reign before he could transform more people, before his Phyrexian forces grew too numerous to defeat. Through all of this, Rebbec found herself trapped in an impossible position. She still loved Glacian, but he was barely present anymore. Most days he lay in his chambers, mind fragmented beyond recovery, speaking in voices that weren't his own. Yawgmoth visited him regularly, adjusting his serum, and Rebbec noticed that the two halves of the Power Stone Dyft had split. The one used to create the portal were no longer in their secure storage. She searched for them, found nothing, asked Yawgmoth where they had gone. He smiled that cold smile and said nothing. Dyft, the planeswalker, had disappeared. She had opened the portal as promised, but the war troubled her. She had meant to help, to provide a place of healing. Instead, she had given Yawgmoth the resources to create an army. She withdrew from Dominaria, seeking answers or perhaps just escape from the guilt of what she'd enabled. The Battle of Mageddon Defile was where the war turned catastrophic. The Alliance's main army, tens of thousands strong, marched through a mountain pass toward Halcyon. Yawgmoth's forces met them there. Phyrexians and augmented guards, but more importantly, the Null Sphere. The Null Sphere was Glacian's design, a massive Power Stone-powered structure that had been built to monitor and control the Empire's artifact warriors. It was larger than Halcyon itself, a shell of metal and energy anchored in a deep crater. Yawgmoth had seized it in a previous skirmish, and now he used its full power. The Null Sphere could control every artifact creature in the Thran Empire. When Yawgmoth activated it during the Battle of Mageddon Defile, every artifact warrior fighting for the Alliance suddenly turned on its masters. The betrayal was instantaneous and absolute. Constructs that had been defending their creators a moment before now attacked with ruthless efficiency. The Alliance army was slaughtered. Tens of thousands died in hours. And when it was done, Yawgmoth dropped a stone charger, a Power Stone weapon that released all its stored energy at once, on the survivors. The resulting death cloud, a miasma of necrotic energy, killed everything it touched. Halcyon celebrated the victory. Yawgmoth stood before them and offered a choice. The Alliance would send more armies. More death was coming. But there was a sanctuary, Phyrexia, where people could go to be changed, to be made strong enough to survive what was coming. About half of Halcyon's population accepted. They walked through the portal willingly, believing Yawgmoth's promises of safety and transformation. The other half locked themselves in their homes, hoping the war would pass them by. Rebbec, watching this exodus, made her choice. She confronted Yawgmoth one final time before he could descend to Phyrexia to oversee the transformations. "Show me," she demanded. "Show me what you've really built there." He took her. Phyrexia had changed since Rebecc's last visit. The outer sphere, which had been a mechanical jungle, was now a twisted parody of nature. Oily rain fell from a sunless red sky. Metal trees grew in patterns that hurt to look at too long. Dragon engines, massive creatures that were part organic, part mechanical, all horrifying, prowled through the artificial landscape. But this was just the first sphere, the face Phyrexia showed to newcomers. Below it, in the second sphere, the ruins of the first were piled like refuse. Below that, a labyrinth of pipes that defied normal geometry, space-bending in ways that made it impossible to navigate without Yawgmoth's guidance. The fourth sphere was where most of the transformation happened. Vast facilities filled with vats where newts, as the unconverted humans were called, were grown and changed. Vat priests monitored the process, adjusting chemical balances, grafting metal to flesh, removing weakness, and replacing it with strength. This was where the Thran who had come for healing were taken. This was where they died and were reborn as something else. But it was the sixth sphere that truly horrified Rebbec. There, in chambers devoted to Yawgmoth's inner circle, the demons and praetors who served him most closely, she found the delegates. The representatives from the 25 nations who had come to Halcyon demanding justice. They were still alive, technically, but they had been changed, experimented on, mutilated in ways that served no purpose except to satisfy Yawgmoth's curiosity about non-human anatomy. Their bodies were spread across tables, opened and examined, kept conscious through methods Rebbec couldn't begin to understand and didn't want to. And in one chamber, she found Dyfed, the planeswalker who had opened the portal who had meant to help. She was strapped to a table, a power stone blade driven through her skull at an angle that scrambled her brain just enough to prevent coherent thought. Yawgmoth's vat priests were vivisecting her, carefully removing pieces to study them, trying to find the planeswalker organ that would explain her power. There was no such organ. Planeswalking wasn't a physical trait that could be transplanted, but Yawgmoth was determined to understand it anyway, even if that meant killing the only planeswalker he had access to in the process. Rebbec removed the blade. Dyfed, given a moment of clarity, used what was left of her power to die, simply ended her own life rather than endure another second of Yawgmoth's examination. "You're insane," Rebbec whispered. "I'm visionary," Yawgmoth corrected, standing in the doorway. He had followed her, watched her discover his secrets. "Everything I've done has been in service of a greater goal, to perfect life itself, to eliminate weakness and death. Yes, the methods are harsh. Yes, there are casualties, but the end result will justify everything. These people didn't volunteer to become your research subjects. They came to make war on me. They threatened everything I've built. What did they expect would happen? And Dyfed? She helped you. She was useful. Now she's more useful as a subject of study." He stepped closer. "You can't understand yet, Rebbec, but you will. Once you're properly transformed, once you see reality through new eyes, you'll understand that everything I've done is necessary. Stay away from me. It's too late for that." His voice was soft, almost gentle. "I've merged with Phyrexia itself, become one with the plane. My consciousness extends through every sphere, every mechanism. And I merged with you too, back when you first came here. Just a little bit, enough to mark you as mine. You're connected to this place now, whether you like it or not. We could rule together, you and I. Your vision for building, combined with my understanding of perfection. We could reshape not just Dominaria, but the entire multiverse." Rebbec felt it then. The violation, the sense that something foreign had been planted in her mind during her first visit to Phyrexia. Yawgmoth had touched her consciousness, left a trace of himself there. The connection was faint but real. She rejected it utterly, slammed mental barriers against that invasive presence, severing the link through sheer force of will. It hurt, like tearing away part of her own thoughts, but she did it anyway. "No," she said, "I won't be yours. I won't help you, and I won't let you have Dominaria." She ran, through the 6th sphere, back through the pipe maze of the 3rd, racing toward the portal. Yawgmoth didn't chase her physically. He didn't need to. Phyrexia itself was his body now. But he was busy, called back to Dominaria by urgent reports. The Alliance had sent 2 more armies, was besieging Halcyon even as they spoke. Rebbec reached the portal and stepped through, back into the caves of Koilos, back to Dominaria. She climbed to the surface, to what was left of Halcyon, and found the city dying. The null sphere had been hurled into orbit by Yawgmoth's engineers to escape capture by the Alliance. From its position in space, it could theoretically control artifacts across the entire continent. But the engineers inside, Thran, who had finally understood what they were serving, had sabotaged the controls. They were sacrificing themselves, letting the sphere's orbit degrade, causing it to accumulate energy that would eventually be released as another massive death cloud. The city was being evacuated. Those who hadn't gone to Phyrexia were trying to reach the Thran Temple, Rebbec's floating masterpiece, hoping it could be converted into an ark. But the temple's systems were failing. Without constant maintenance, the power stone matrix was destabilizing. And then there was Glacian. Still in his chambers, still alive somehow despite everything, Rebbec found him lying in his bed, more machine now than man. Yawgmoth had been treating him with more than just serum, gradually replacing failing organs with mechanical ones. She examined him, searching for answers in his augmented body. That's when she found them. The two halves of the power stone that Dyft had split to create the portal. Yawgmoth had hidden them inside Glacian's own wounds, placed them where no one would think to look. The radiation from these raw stones was what had kept Glacian sick all these years, despite the serum. Yawgmoth had deliberately sabotaged his patient's recovery to keep Rebbec dependent, desperate, willing to make increasingly terrible compromises. Glacian was dying because Yawgmoth wanted him to die. Slowly, painfully. While Yawgmoth stole Rebbec's affections and built his empire of transformed horrors, she removed the stones. The damage was done. Glacian would not recover. But in death, finally, his mind cleared. The Glacian she remembered, the brilliant artificer she had loved, returned for one last moment. "Close it," he whispered, his essence now trapped in the power stones themselves through some property of their unique resonance. "Close the portal. Lock him out. It's the only way." "How?" "Unite the stones. Use them to seal the portal from this side. He won't be able to reopen it from Phyrexia, not without these specific stones. You'll trap him there forever. And you? I'll be with you. In the stones. Always." It was a terrible plan. It would seal away not just Yawgmoth, but the thousands of Thran who had gone to Phyrexia. The transformed, the sick, the desperate, all of them trapped on that artificial plane with a madman who saw them only as resources to be refined. But what choice was there? Yawgmoth would not stop, could not be negotiated with or reasoned with. He would transform all of Dominaria given the chance, remake every living thing according to his vision of perfection. The final battle came as death clouds rolled across Phyrexia. Yawgmoth had unleashed stone chargers on every remaining army, every city that opposed him, every center of resistance. The energy released was apocalyptic, but he had miscalculated. The null sphere, damaged and falling, released its stored energy directly over Halcyon. The death cloud engulfed the city. Those who had remained, hoping to weather the war in their homes, died instantly. The city itself became a tomb, its gleaming streets and floating platforms now monuments to the Empire's hubris. Only the portal chamber remained untouched, deep enough in the caves that the death cloud hadn't penetrated. Yawgmoth, realizing what had happened, ordered all remaining Thran to evacuate through the portal. They obeyed, streaming into Phyrexia by the thousands. Better to be transformed than to die in the poisoned air above. Rebbec was alone in the caves, alone with Glacian's body, with the two halves of the portal stone, with the choice that would define the rest of her life. Yawgmoth returned through the portal, his form now something beyond human. He had merged so completely with Phyrexia that his physical body was just an avatar, a temporary manifestation of his will. He stood before Rebbec, offering one final time for her to join him. "Everything dies," he said, "except us. Come with me, be transformed, be perfect, be immortal." "I'd rather die human," she replied. She pressed the two halves of the stone together. The portal, which had been a stable gateway maintained by the energy differential between the split stone, collapsed instantly. The dimensional rift closed with a sound like thunder, like the world itself cracking. Yawgmoth, caught halfway through, was pulled back into Phyrexia. He raged, threw his power against the sealed portal, trying to force it open from the other side. But Rebbec had used the correct stones, the specific power stone that Dyft had cracked to open the portal in the first place. Without those stones, without their unique resonance, the portal could not be reopened. Not from Phyrexia, not by Yawgmoth. He was trapped, He and all the Thran who had followed him through, thousands of people sealed away in a nightmarish artificial plane with a mad god who would spend the next 5 millennia perfecting his art of transformation. Rebbec sat in the darkness of the caves, clutching the unified stone, feeling Glacian's essence within it. She wept for her husband, for her city, for the empire that had reached so high and fallen so far. Above her, the death clouds began to disperse. The war was over, but there were no victors. The Thran Empire was gone. Its cities were ruins. Its people were dead or transformed or scattered to the far corners of Dominaria. The age of the Thran had ended. 5,000 years. That's how long Yawgmoth remained trapped in Phyrexia, unable to return to Dominaria. 5,000 years spent perfecting his Phyrexians, creating new generations, building layer upon layer of grotesque beauty in that mechanical hell. But the Thran's legacy persisted. Their ruins dotted Phyrexia and beyond. In Shiv, in Kalaman, on distant islands. Archaeologists in later ages would uncover Thran artifacts, marveling at the sophistication of their construction, puzzling over how such advanced technology could have been created in an age before recorded history. 2 brothers, Urza and Mishra, would one day discover a Thran power stone in the caves of Koilos. The stone would split when they touched it, each brother taking half. Their rivalry over those halves would escalate into the Brothers' War, a conflict that would reshape Dominaria almost as thoroughly as the Thran-Phyrexian War had. Urza, after becoming a planeswalker, would spend his long life hunting for Phyrexia, obsessed with destroying the plane that had corrupted his brother Mishra. When he finally found it, when he assembled the 9 titans to assault Yawgmoth's realm, he would discover a horror beyond comprehension. Phyrexia had grown in power, its inhabitants having transcended their Thran origins to become something entirely new, something that existed only to spread, to corrupt, to complete. The power stone that sealed the portal, the stone containing Glacian's essence, would pass through many hands. Urza would eventually reclaim it, would use it as the cornerstone of a device called the Legacy, a weapon designed to destroy Yawgmoth once and for all. And it would work. Eventually, but not before millions more died. Not before Yawgmoth nearly consumed all of Dominaria in his final assault. The evil that had been born in the laboratories of Halcyon, nurtured in the caves below the Mana Rig, perfected in the 9 spheres of Phyrexia, that evil would cast a shadow across 5,000 years of history. Some say Rebbec became something more after sealing the portal, that her spirit merged with Dominaria itself, becoming a guardian against Yawgmoth's eventual return. The legends are unclear, mixing truth with myth across the millennia. But when Yawgmoth finally did break free from Phyrexia, when he descended upon Dominaria as a godlike cloud of black mana, Urza's weapon, powered by Glacian's stone, by the essence of the Artificer who had proven the multiverse's mathematics, seemed to recognize something in its target. Recognition and rejection both. The light that destroyed Yawgmoth was white mana, pure and absolute. And some who witnessed it claimed they saw 2 forms in that light, a man and a woman, an artificer and an architect. Glacian and Rebbec reunited one final time to end what they had inadvertently begun. But that's 5,000 years in the future. In the caves of Koilos, as Rebbec sat alone in the darkness, none of that mattered. The empire was gone. Her husband was dead. The world she knew had ended. She emerged from the caves eventually, found survivors, not many but some. The Alliance armies that had besieged Halcyon had been caught in the death clouds too, but stragglers remained. Together, they began the work of rebuilding. It would take generations. The knowledge that had built the Thran Empire's wonders was lost, sealed away in ruins or trapped with Yawgmoth in Phyrexia. The survivors would have to start over, learning to live without power stones, without floating cities, without the casual mastery over nature that had defined Thran civilization. They would forget in time. The exact details would blur into myth, Children would grow up hearing stories about an ancient empire that had touched the sky and been struck down for its hubris. They would be told cautionary tales about a healer who became a monster, about the dangers of pursuing perfection without wisdom. But some things would remain. The null sphere, now the null moon, would orbit Dominaria forever, a silent reminder of the Thran's last war. The caves of Koilos would be sealed, but never forgotten, a pilgrimage site for those seeking to understand the past. And in the deepest ruins, in the places where only the bravest archaeologists dared venture, Thran artifacts would wait, still functional after millennia, their powerstones still humming with captured energy. The Thran had been humanity's first empire. They had mastered artifice, bent reality to their will, built wonders that later ages could barely comprehend. They had been glorious and terrible in equal measure, wise and foolish, inspired and cursed. They had reached for perfection and grasped only ruin, had sought to transcend their limitations and instead created the greatest limitation of all, a god of metal and malice who would threaten existence itself. Their story was a warning, but also, in its way, a testament. They had dreamed the impossible and made it real, had pushed the boundaries of what civilization could achieve, had built monuments that would stand for eons. The Thran Empire had fallen, but its echoes would never truly die. In every artificer who worked with powerstones, in every invention that pushed past the boundaries of the possible, in every attempt to improve upon nature through artifice and will, there the Thran lived on. And deep in Phyrexia, sealed away but never gone, Yawgmoth waited, perfecting his art, building his armies, planning his return. The Thran had ended, but their greatest mistake was just beginning. 5,000 years is a long time, but for a god, for a being who had transcended mortality and merged with an entire plane of existence, time meant nothing. Yawgmoth had patience. He had vision. He had an eternity to plot his revenge on the world that had rejected him. The Thran's fall was complete. But the story that began in their gleaming streets and shadowed caves would echo through the ages, would shape the destiny of Dominaria and beyond, would influence events that none of them could have predicted. This is the legacy of the Thran. Not just their artifacts or their ruins, but the choices they made, the prices they paid, the evil they unleashed in their pursuit of the good. We remember them, we study their ruins, we marvel at their achievements, and we pray we're wiser than they were. If you've drifted through this long story with me, through the rise and fall of history's first great empire, thank you. The Thran's tale is one of ambition and consequence, of brilliance and blindness, of how the line between healing and harm can blur until it disappears entirely. There are more stories to tell from the multiverse. More planes to explore, more histories to uncover, more legends that have been sleeping in the archives, waiting for someone to give them voice again. If this journey through ancient Dominaria resonated with you, consider subscribing. Let these tales of magic and mystery, of triumph and tragedy accompany you into sleep or study, into contemplation or dreams. The multiverse is vast. Its stories are endless. And I'll be here, in the quiet spaces between, ready to guide you through them. Until next time, may your rest be peaceful and your dreams be filled with wonders.